All right, here we are. Here's the topic for today. I have a very nice map here that was done by Steve Goen. Shows the main line. Let's see. Oops. How do I go back? Okay. Shows the main line to the left or the west, and then in red you have the line of interest here. Okay. So, and then of course the logo down there. So, now, up to this point, I have purposely not tried to pronounce the name of this section of railroad because it gets botched up. Now, I'm not sure what the correct pronunciation is. It's definitely not Nelleva. Okay, that's just totally misspelled. But I have seen that spelling in an official Southern Pacific timetable, Nelleva. Okay, it's definitely not vanilla. So, second bulletin, it's either Nelleva or Nelleva, okay? One of those two. I haven't, no one's corrected me yet and said it's one or the other, so I'm just gonna switch back and forth, whatever comes out of my mouth. All right. The name derives from the daughters of two railroad officials for the Houston and Texas Central, okay, Nellie and Eva, okay? These were railroad officials at the time that the line was being constructed. If I want to avoid mispronunciation, I can play it safe and just say Mexia Cutoff. And there's no doubt about did I say it right, okay? Now, as it turns out, in my research, I found that there's probably a half a dozen ways to call this railroad line, okay? And I'm gonna mix them up. I'm gonna use almost one of the six at least once during this program. Okay, first question, what was it? All right, so the Mexia Cutoff was an airline, meaning a shortcut, that was built by the Houston and Texas Central Railroad between 1905 and 1906. Some sources say 1907, but it was really completed in the December of 1906. And it was simply built to reduce the mileage between Mexia and Navasota. Right. And now, in a minute, I'll get to why was it built. That's probably an even bigger question. All right, a little prehistory here before we delve into the cutoff itself. The original railroad was the Galveston and Red River Railway. It was undertaken by Galveston interests as opposed to Houston interests. But oddly enough, it started in Houston and built up to Cypress between 1852 and 1856. Then in 1856, the charter was amended to the more familiar Houston and Texas Central Railway. In 1890, it became under another reorganization, it became the Houston and Texas Central Railroad. Okay, that often happened with railroads. They go switch back and forth during reorganizations between railway and railroad, keeping the same basic name. So by 1860, it had reached from Houston to Milliken, and there it stopped during the Civil War. Okay. Here's kind of a progression of how it built following the Civil War. Of course, the Civil War interrupted new construction, reconstruction afterwards. You know, financing was difficult, labor was iffy, and so forth. But finally got underway from Milliken, heading north up to Bryan and Hearn. Okay. Bremond was reached in 1870, Corsicana in 1871. Also, Austin was reached in 1871. That was a different line or branch off to the west. Now, the interesting thing is that the H&TC was a broad gauge railroad, which was very common in early Texas and other states to the south. 5 feet, 6 inches. All right. once it got to Corsicana, they changed. They started building a railroad north of Corsicana to standard gauge, okay? 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Of course, that's going to introduce some interesting problems, okay? Now, before I continue any further with the history, I want to interject some additional information that I found. You know, as you research a topic like this, you always come across little tidbits of information that make for an interesting thread on its own, okay? Don't have time to dwell on it in depth, but what I found out in researching this early history of the Houston and Texas Central after the Civil War is in 1867, there was a big epidemic of yellow fever ranging from Galveston up to Bryan, okay? You have to wonder how they ever managed with this epidemic going on to even continue construction, you know, up to, from Milliken up to Bryan and Hearn. But somehow they managed to do it. Milliken, in fact, was heavily impacted by the yellow fever plague. All right, so continuing on, H&TC reached Dallas in 1872, Red River in 1873. They actually stopped at a place called the Red River City, and later it was cut back to Denison, which wasn't that far away, where it linked up with the Katy Railroad. It actually turned out the Katy and the H&TC bypassed each other and weren't going to make accommodations for the other railroad, but they finally compromised. Red River City was abandoned, and H&TC interchanged with them in Denison. All right, so 1874, they were running 2 mainline freights, 2 passenger trains, H&TC. Now, we're talking about the main line, okay? And over the course of time, H&TC would be composed of 12 different component systems, okay? Smaller railroads that they incorporated. 1874, they were organizational-wise, the railroad was composed of 3 divisions: Southern, Northern, and Western. Now the issue with the dual gauges. Okay, so I said they built broad gauge up to Corsicana. Okay, standard gauge north of Corsicana. That meant that at Corsicana and Hearn, because at Hearn, the H&TC crossed the International and Great Northern, the INGN. INGN was a standard gauge railroad. So that means one or two things. When you're interchanging freight or passengers at those 2 locations, you either had to do a cross-platform transfer, or you had to lift up the cars off their what's the word I'm looking for? Trucks, that's right, thank you. Off their trucks, and then transfer them all over to either broad gauge or narrow gauge trucks. Okay. As near as I can as near as I can determine, the freight was a cross-platform transfer. The passengers, I'm not sure about, still not sure about. But it was one or the other. And that, of course, that was time consuming. Okay? Not desirable at all. All right. So, in 1874, they started to re-gauge the main line, starting at Corsicana, heading south to Hearn, okay? And then followed by Hearn to Houston. So it wasn't done in one fell swoop. Okay, it was done over a course of 2 years. And then, of course, the line to Austin was done even later. Okay. By the way, there used to be an interesting write-up on this very topic in the Robertson County Root Gen, or their genealogical website, but it's been taken down. Fortunately, I saved it, so if anybody's interested in reading that sometime, it's well worth reading how they actually went about changing the gauge of the railroad. You can also find it in two newspaper articles. If you're familiar with Portal to Texas History, I think it's the Galveston News, they did a report on the gauge change. All right, continue on. Again, dealing with the organization of the railroad. Again, this is the main line. This is before the cutoff had even been built. It was the divisions were just called First and Second Division. Okay. And then by World War I, the division names were changed. It was now the Dallas Division and the Austin Division. Okay, so there were organizational changes transpiring over time. Later on, by 1934, when all those Texas-Louisiana lines came under the Texas-New Orleans umbrella, okay, then you ended up with even more divisions. The main ones were Dallas, Austin. Later on, they combined the two to Dallas, Austin, Houston, Victoria, San Antonio, and there were a few others. Okay. All right, now, big question. Why was it built? Okay, so it was built in the early 1900s during the chairmanship of E.H. Harriman, who was in control of both the Union Pacific and the Southern Pacific Railroads, okay, including the lines in Texas. Okay? It's considered to be a spoiler to Rock Island's attempt under Benjamin Yoakum, who was a local businessman. Some of you may have read about him. And it was an attempt by the Rock Island to reach the Texas Gulf Coast. And they did it. They initially tried to do it on their own by building, or at least surveying a route to the Gulf Coast. And then they decided, well, the Trinity and Brazos Valley is in the making. Let's just take it over, or partially take it over, and use it as our means to the Gulf Coast. And that's what they did. Yeah. Now, there's also some speculation that Harriman intended for the Mexia Cutoff to also be a bypass or kind of a secondary line to connect the Union Pacific in Kansas with its lines in Texas. And they were considering, this is the Union Pacific, or Harriman was considering buying the Missouri, Oklahoma, and Gulf Railroad, MO&G, later called the KO&G, but that never happened. Okay. But some people think that might have, the Mexia Cutoff might have fit into the plans for that link up. All right. So, shorter railroad, only 15 miles shorter than the main line. Wasn't even worth it. Okay. All right. So the Mexia Cutoff, or Nelleva Cutoff, was 94 miles long. It took off from south of Mexia to just north of Navasota. Okay. Started in 1905, completed at the, I need to change that. It should be 1906, December of 1906, almost 1907. Okay. It was a line with low grades, and it was almost tangent, almost a straight line. Okay. And by the way, here's a postcard. I bought this probably 40 years ago. Probably had no clue at the time the significance of it until I started doing this program, and I thought, hey, you know what? I've got this picture. It's a postcard. It shows. You get a magnifying glass. It shows AGTC here. I bet that's a construction train. All right. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. All right. Okay. So December of 1906, newspapers announced the news that the line is open and ready for business. Okay. First trains that were going to run on it was a mixed train. Okay. They held off running freights on it for a while because I guess they wanted the things to kind of settle in, new construction. So they ran a mixed train, one train in each direction each day. Okay. This is an article taken from the Mexia State Herald. I did find out, this is another kind of a side bit of information, that they actually opened the section of track between Mexia and Jewett in July of 1906. So that part was already open for business before they completed the part of the line south of Jewett. All right, 1910, there was a notice in the Trade Journal Engineering News that the H&TC had filed an application to basically upgrade the line, or at least 57 miles of the line, okay, with 75-pound rail, okay, up from 61.5-pound rail. Now, until I read that, I had never heard of 61.5-pound rail, never. Okay, so that was eye-opening to me. The original H&TC railroad, the main line, was built with 56-pound rail. Okay. All right, so the same article mentions about new terminal buildings, tracks in North Zulch. They actually laid a foundation for a roundhouse in North Zulch. I don't know if anybody's ever gone to see if they could find it or not, but the foundation was laid there. It turns out both North Zulch and Norman G were places where the passenger trains would meet. It's one of the other towns. It just depended from year to year. So I guess North Zulch was to take on a new level of importance if they had followed through on their construction.
I've never seen Norman G spelled 2 words.
Norman G.
Is that right?
I don't know. I mean,
There was a oh,
I've always seen it as one word. You know. All right. Okay, here's a list of stations as of 1922. Okay, starting from the south at the junction, Nelleva Junction, which was just north of Navasota, on north to just south of Mexia, where it came into the main line, Mexia Junction. Okay. What caught my eye was the number of spurs on this line. I figured there were probably few, if any, spurs on this line. Okay. All right, facilities, okay? What in the way of facilities was provided on this line? So here's a list. Again, this is from 1922. It gives you at least a snapshot view of what existed. Maybe not from the beginning, but certainly 15 years after the line was open. Turntables at Mexia Yard, Y tracks, water stations, fuel oil. Of course, they were burning oil at this time. Section houses every 8 miles. And who knows, maybe one of those still exists as somebody's home or something. Sometimes they do. And stock pens. And stock pens, of course, they had varying capacities, from 2 or 3 stock cars on up. Let me mention something else here. This is another one of my asides. Up until early 90s, south of Mexia, there were the remnants of a concrete roundhouse out somewhere south of town. Okay, it looked like maybe 3 or 4 stalls at most. Okay. Also, since we're going to talk about Mexia here for a minute, let me just mention Mexia was kind of a go-getter. They tried to get the shops for the Trinity and Brazos Valley. And of course, they were built here in T. Okay, and then in the 19-teens, they tried to convince the Houston and Texas Central to move their shops from Ennis to Mexia. Well, Ennis took them to court and they lost. Okay. So, I also will mention here that Ennis originally got the shops from Corsicana. The shops are originally in Corsicana. Okay, and then Ennis made some kind of a deal. I think a lot of it had to do with water supply. And I think it's around 1890, the H&TC moved their shops up to to Ennis from Corsicana. If you ever look at old Sanborn maps, especially in the 1880s and 90s, you can see some of the shop buildings in Corsicana. They're kind of north and east of where the depot was. Okay, pictures. I think we've already seen this, but H&TC Depot in Mexia. All right. Not far from here was a little park that the railroad maintained, at least for a while. They also had a separate freight depot. I think we saw that in Dylan's slides. And we've also seen this before. This is the competitors' depot, both freight and passenger. I think it was what? It was only about a block away, wasn't it? Yeah. One or two, most. Got to mention the big oil fields south of town. Generated a lot of business for both railroads. Okay, not sure exactly which railroad this is. Okay, yeah, one or the other. I think you also had this slide here, or this picture, aerial view. Oops, how do I go back? Oop. All right, let's see. Somewhere right in here are the H&TC depots, freight and passenger, and then over here somewhere is the Trinity and Brazos Valley Depot. All right, here's an interesting map, okay? A U.S. Army map from about 1920, okay? Let's see if I can do this right. Mexia's here. Two lines are run south of town, basically parallel. T&BV crosses over here. There's an interlocking tower, and then heads on east to T. All right. And then the main line continues on south here, and then it splits here. The main line continues on down here, and then the Mexia Cutoff branches off down in this direction, kind of the southeast. All right, Jewett. So on the left, I have a postcard photo of what's called Railroad Avenue in Jewett. I'm going to guess that probably faces the INGN Railroad, not the H&TC. Okay. And then on the right, we have a picture of the depot, H&TC Depot, which was really a little bit west of the main part of Jewett. And it looks like in that picture that that was probably soon after construction. There was a lot of cleared out space and so forth. Again, that's one of those postcards I bought probably 40 years ago. Thought to myself, where is Jewett? Okay, you know, of what use is this? I'll collect it anyway, and up and surfaces in time for this program. All right, another Army map here. This I thought was very interesting because I didn't realize, well, I knew there was lignite down here, but I didn't realize how many lignite spurs existed down here. There's one called the Beargrass Spur, the Evansville Spur, a couple other spurs here. All right, come down here. Okay, so here's the main business district of Jewett on the INGN. The H&TC line comes over here. This is where their depot was. It's really kind of west of town or southwest of town. And then over here is where the Trinity and Brazos Valley cross the IGN. Same map, but just a little bit different section of it. So here's the Trinity and Brazos Valley here, H&TC, and then down here, there's a section where they're right next to each other, parallel each other, and then they kind of diverge. One goes, H&TC go through Robbins, and the Trinity Brazos Valley goes off over here.
This is the first of 3 pictures of the town from the water tower behind Shaw's Gin. This shows 2 depots, the Kyle Hotel where the Star office is today, and the school in the left background.
Hey, there's the 2 depots. Trinity and Brazos Valley in the front and the H&TC in the back. Okay. Navasota, okay, that was a Union Depot. Both the Santa Fe and the H&TC used that depot. And then the INGN, or Missouri Pacific, had its own separate depot in Navasota. Hempstead, okay. Now, Hempstead is really on the main line. It's not really on the Mexia Cutoff, but oftentimes their passenger trains would terminate there. So I'm including it in this presentation. Let's see. Here is the branch line over here, this side of the depot that goes off to Austin, and here's the main line over here. This, I'm told, is a express building. The main depot is behind it, and fortunately, I have a better slide of that. This is the H&TC depot in Hempstead, which I'm told exists today in some form or another at a little place called, is it Round? There's a lot of antiques. Round Tape? Round Top, yeah. The Hempstead Depot, apparently at Round Top. Maybe it didn't quite look like that, but it's there. Yeah. Okay. All right, what would a railroad story be without at least one train robbery? So I found this in the newspapers by luck, okay? This is a little bit of a mystery. Okay, February 21st, 1913, Brian Eagle, was a newspaper, said that some 2 masked men boarded train number 3 at 1 o'clock in the morning. Conductor beat them back, and they jumped the train, and train proceeded, and they were never seen again. So, all right, so a little excitement on the Mexia Cutoff. Now, I say it's a mystery because at that time, H&TC, I think, was only running a mixed train. It was during the daylight, okay? And it wasn't train number 3. It was trains, I think, 31 and 32. Well, it turns out that TNBV was running 2 passenger trains. One was a night train, which I thought was kind of okay. I didn't know they ran a night train. It was a train 3, but the times weren't right. Okay, it was 1 o'clock in the morning was too early to be where this attempted robbery occurred. So something's not right here. The time, the place, or the train number. Okay, reporter got something wrong in his report. Huh? Okay, maybe all 3. Yeah, maybe he just made up the story. All right, so one of the few things that I was able to find in print about the Mexia Cutoff was this quote by S.G. Reed, which some of you may know. He's kind of the venerable dean of Texas railroad history, 1940 and prior. He wrote a book called History of Texas Railroads. Mention it here. This is what he said. It's used almost exclusively for through freight and passenger trains. Local traffic was negligible. All right. That's what he says. All right. After going through my evidence, my claim is that there were no through freights or through passenger trains, with one exception, that show up in timetables. Okay. Now, you wouldn't expect freight trains to show up in a public timetable anyway. All right. But I went through employee timetables, and I don't see any times for I don't see any through freights mentioned at all. Okay. Now I'll say something about that further in a minute. All right, freight traffic. Cotton was king. Okay. There's a bill of lading here. It's from Mexia. for a load of cotton, going someplace, I think Connecticut. All right. And then we have, of course, the front cover of H&TC timetable, and it basically lists the main agricultural products that you would have found being transported. H&TC had at least one named freight train dealing with the cotton business called the Cotton Ball. If you look over here on the far right, you'll see stations mentioned that are on the main line. But I have it on anecdotal basis by somebody who worked with the H&TC starting in 1926. He fired on this train, and he said that he told me once that it went at least sometimes on the Nelleva Cutoff. Okay. And I'm sure there were freight trains that went on the Nelleva Cutoff, but they must have been extras or seasonal trains. Okay, which would not ordinarily appear in an employee timetable. I kind of threw this in here. It's kind of a gallery of H&TC timetables through the years. The first three, starting from the left, would have predated the Nelleva Cutoff. The last one, of course, would include it. Okay. Oops. I like this one in particular. This dates from, I think, 1891. Okay. Notice all the good luck charms that are on it. Okay. I think there's a reason for that. All right. I think the PR department of the H&TC was trying to convey a message. Well, sometime in the late 1800s, a reporter, or maybe the editor of the Dallas News, wrote a scathing report on the H&TC, and he dubbed it the Angel Maker. Okay, they had a lot of wrecks. And I think as a response to that, they kind of gussied up their timetable to make it look like this is the luckiest railroad you could ride. Okay. All right. I noticed the timetable, the second from the right, has been used in some of the displays around here. It's a rather colorful timetable. Okay. And then sometime in the early 19-teens, the H&TC kind of rebranded itself as the Sunset Central. Okay. Which included Houston, East and West Texas, Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio, and a few other Texas lines. And that lasted, I don't know, for about 3 to 5 years. Okay. All right, passenger service. Okay, so from the very beginning, almost to the end, there was at least daily mixed train service, which means trains that had a combination of passenger cars and freight cars. Okay, and here are some of the train numbers listed here. These are, the second pair is usually the Sunday only train. The first pair is the rest of the week. So the numbers changed over time. Here, over here on the left is a pass from Jewett to Ennis. Here is a example schedule. This is from 1914. Notice the train goes, I think at this time it was not a mixed train. I meant to X out that the word mixed there. I think it was actually a pure passenger train, or regular passenger train. All right, so while most of the passenger service was in the form of mixed trains, there were a few years there where it was actually a regular passenger train without the freight cars, mainly around 1914 to 1915. All right, I mentioned earlier that there was no through passenger service with one exception. That one exception that I found was 1918. under the USRA, that was under the administration of the federal government, they briefly ran the owl over the Nelleva Cutoff. Didn't stop at any of the stations, it just was detoured over the line. Okay. So you couldn't get on it, at least not legally, at any of those stations that I showed you early on the cutoff. I don't know. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, okay? Because usually the night train would stop several stops. And by the way, there was, I think during this time period, there was actually more than one night train. Okay, there was the Owl and there was another one. Okay. So maybe the Owl was a little bit faster than the other one. Okay, when you do research something like this and you make a claim, the more you research, the more you find exceptions to what you claim. So, let's see, 1914, for some reason or another, traffic fell off and they had to cut some trains over the entire system. And one of the trains was 3 and 2, okay? And then they reinstituted the mixed trains in their place. Now, one of the contradictions here, you know, I keep saying there's no through trains except the Owl, okay? The newspaper article claims that this train went all the way from Houston to Mexia. I would kind of call that a through train, okay? It went further than Hempstead and all the way up to Mexia. But as it turns out, like the schedules, this train they're talking about actually went as far as Ennis. So it was actually a Houston-Ennis train. All right. So I would call that a through train. It wasn't necessarily Houston to Dallas, but I would call it a through train. Okay, all right, so on the main line over here, you know, through Hearn and Bryan, of course, those places over there, you actually had some big name trains. And here's a list of them. All right, some of them are familiar to you, others maybe not so familiar. Okay. The Owl, of course, was the very last named passenger train on the main line, 1958. You know, oddly enough, between the Pacific lines of the Southern Pacific and what was called the Atlantic lines, or the Texas and Louisiana lines, there was some duplication of names. Both Texas and the Pacific Coast had a train called the Owl, an overnight train. Both of them had a train called the Lark. Okay, the one on the West Coast is probably more famous, but there was one in Texas. Actually, the Lark was a Dallas, Hearn, San Antonio train. Okay. And then for a while there in the 1920s and teens, there were 1 to 3 trains run every day between Dallas and Mexia because of the oil boom. Those were the oil field specialists. Okay, so 1931, almost to the end of the line here, the railroad tried to pull a fast one. It went to the Attorney General of Texas. There was a phrase in the regulations or something like that, something about at least you had to run at least 1 train a day. The railroad tried to interpret that as, well, we can run a train northbound one day and then a southbound the next day, as opposed to a northbound and a southbound the same day. Try to pull a fast one on this. And the Attorney General said, no, what we really mean is you need to run 1 train a day each way, period. Well, with Sundays accepted. Okay. Now there were some other exceptions. If you were a railroad under 50 miles and so forth, you didn't have to abide by this rule, but the Mexia Cutoff certainly needed to follow this rule. Okay, so for you educators out there and railroad historians and otherwise skeptics, all right, this, I really didn't intend for you to read this. This was for my benefit, the spreadsheet. I went through a number of employee timetables that I found online to try to see what was operating during the time period of the timetable. And this is what I found. Trains, usually mixed trains, either Mexia to Navasota or Mexia to Hempstead. There's one exception, I think, the owl here. Just for a short time, 1918 under the USRA. Okay. So a lot of my claims are based on what I found here. Now, having said that, notice that my collection here has a span of about 9 years where I don't have any information. So if I had a complete collection, might discover some surprises. But from what I was able to glean from the known information, I claimed what I claimed earlier about the through trains and so forth. Okay, so 1933, actually in 32, the railroad filed for abandonment. The state fought it, but they went out and the line was abandoned in 1933, except for 7 miles. I found out that 7 miles from Mexia still was in service for at least another year. Okay, so it wasn't completely abandoned. Most of it was. And then, of course, a lot of the right-of-way became Farm to Market Road number 39. Okay, so if you ever drive that, you're on the Nelleva Mexia Cutoff. All right, here are my thank yous, and here's a list of some of the resources that I didn't already cite. Steve, you need to wake up. You're going to miss it. All right, so a lot of this was stuff in my collection. A friend of mine, Gerald Hook, spruced up some of the photographs. The map, oh, all right. It didn't make it. That should say, the third bullet there should say, a hell of a cutoff. Yeah, a hell of a cutoff. It was a hell of a cutoff. That was Steve's contribution to, in addition to the map. Of course, the tome that S.G. Reed wrote about the history of Texas railroads up to 1940. Southern Pacific had its own employee magazine, separate from the Pacific Lines. And then from 1941 to 1946, this same gentleman, who actually was a freight agent for the SP, wrote a series of articles on Texas, Louisiana railroad, so, related to the Southern Pacific. And there's a lot of information in those articles that it's not in his book. For example, the names of the two daughters whose names contributed to Nelleva. All right? And then all those employee timetables, you can find those online. If you go to that link there, and then the very first slide, I show a picture of Roundhouse. That was actually at Hearn with engine number 86, and I got that from the DeGollier Library at SMU, yeah. All right, thank you very much.